Sometimes the person everyone thinks they know turns out to be someone completely different. Marcus Thompson learned this lesson in the most shocking way possible when what started as typical high school bullying in Jefferson High's cafeteria turned into something that would change how an entire community saw one of their own. The quiet kid who never fought back, who seemed weak and defenseless, was hiding a truth so powerful that when it finally came to light, it didn't just stop the violence, it transformed every single person who witnessed it. This is the story of how one moment of cruelty revealed a hero none of them knew existed, and why sometimes the people we underestimate the most are the ones who end up saving us all. Marcus Thompson had always been different, and at Jefferson High School, different meant invisible at best and a target at worst. He was the kind of student who moved through the hallways like a shadow, keeping his head down, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he was trying to make himself smaller than he already was. At 17, Marcus stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a thin frame that made him look younger than his classmates. His dark hair always seemed to need a trim, falling across his forehead in a way that partially hid his deep brown eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses. What made Marcus truly stand out, though, wasn't just his quiet demeanor or his preference for wearing the same faded jeans and oversized hoodies every day. It was the way he seemed to absorb the cruelty directed at him without ever fighting back. Teachers noticed it, other students whispered about it, and unfortunately the school bullies had made it their personal mission to test just how far they could push him. The cafeteria at Jefferson High was an ecosystem all its own, with invisible boundaries that every student understood instinctively.
The popular kids claimed the tables near the windows. The athletes dominated the center section, and various cliques filled in the spaces between. Marcus ate alone at a small table in the corner, as far from the main traffic as possible, usually with a book propped open beside his lunch tray.
Tyler Rodriguez had been watching Marcus for weeks, and today felt like the perfect opportunity to provide some entertainment for his friends. Tyler was everything Marcus wasn't: tall, confident, with the kind of natural charisma that made other students either want to be his friend or stay out of his way. He played varsity football, drove a pickup truck that his parents had bought him for his 16th birthday, and had never met a situation he couldn't dominate through sheer force of personality. "Watch this," Tyler whispered to his girlfriend Sarah and his best friend Jake as they finished their lunches.
The cafeteria was packed with the usual lunchtime chaos. Hundreds of students talking, laughing, and moving around in the controlled mayhem that defined the noon hour at any high school. Marcus was reading what looked like a worn paperback novel, occasionally taking small bites of his sandwich. He seemed completely absorbed in his book, unaware that he was about to become the center of unwanted attention. This was exactly what Tyler was counting on. Tyler stood up from his table and walked over to where Marcus sat, his friends following behind like a small parade. Other students began to notice the movement, conversations quieting slightly as they sensed something was about to happen. Marcus looked up from his book only when Tyler's shadow fell across his table. "Hey, book boy," Tyler said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "What's so interesting that you can't join the rest of us in the real world?" Marcus looked up, his eyes meeting Tyler's for just a moment, before he looked back down at his book. "Just reading," he said quietly, his voice so soft that Tyler had to lean forward to hear him. "Just reading," Tyler repeated in a mocking tone, turning to his friends with exaggerated disbelief. "Did you hear that? He's just reading." Sarah giggled and Jake shook his head as if he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The attention was beginning to spread. Students at nearby tables had stopped their own conversations and were watching the interaction with the kind of fascination that teenagers have for drama that doesn't involve them directly. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed entertained, but no one made any move to intervene. Marcus tried to go back to his book, but Tyler wasn't finished. He reached over and snatched the paperback from Marcus's hands, holding it up so he could read the cover. "The Count of Monte Cristo," he announced to his growing audience. "Seriously? This is what passes for entertainment in your world." "Could I have that back, please?" Marcus asked, still speaking quietly but with a slight tremor in his voice that suggested he was more affected than he wanted to show. "Could I have that back, please?" Tyler mimicked, making his voice high and whiny. "What do you say we see how much our friend Marcus here really cares about his precious book?" What happened next would be replayed in the minds of every witness for years to come. Tyler opened the paperback and began tearing pages from it, letting them flutter to the floor around Marcus's table. The sound of ripping paper seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet cafeteria. Page after page fell like leaves, and with each torn sheet, Marcus seemed to shrink further into himself. Other students were pulling out their phones now, sensing that this was escalating into something worth recording. The modern teenage instinct to document drama was taking over, and Tyler was playing to his audience.
He was enjoying the attention, the way conversations at other tables had stopped so people could watch his performance. Marcus finally stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He was trembling now, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he made no move toward Tyler. Instead, he knelt down and began collecting the torn pages, his movements careful and deliberate despite his obvious distress.
"Oh, look at this," Tyler said, his voice full of fake sympathy. "I think I made him cry." He looked around at his audience, expecting laughter, and getting it from some corners. "What are you going to do about it, book boy? Going to tell your mommy?" Marcus stopped gathering the pages and looked up at Tyler from where he knelt on the cafeteria floor. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but something deeper and more controlled. It was gone so quickly that Tyler missed it entirely, but a few of the closer observers would remember it later.
"I'm not going to do anything," Marcus said, his voice steadier now. He stood up with the damaged pages in his hands. "You've made your point." But Tyler wasn't ready to let it end there. He had an audience, and he could feel their attention like a drug. This was his moment to establish his dominance, to show everyone at Jefferson High exactly where Marcus Thompson stood in the social hierarchy. "Actually, I don't think I have made my point yet," Tyler said.
He reached over and knocked Marcus's lunch tray off the table, sending his sandwich, apple, and milk carton crashing to the floor. The plastic tray clattered loudly, and milk spread across the linoleum in a white puddle that Marcus would have to walk through to leave.
The cafeteria had gone completely silent now, except for the background hum of the ventilation system and the distant sounds of traffic outside. Even the lunch staff had stopped their work to watch what was unfolding. Mrs. Patterson, one of the cafeteria monitors, took a step forward as if to intervene, but something in the scene made her hesitate. Marcus looked down at the mess, then back up at Tyler.
He didn't say anything, but he didn't back down either. He just stood there, surrounded by torn book pages and spilled milk, holding Tyler's gaze with a steadiness that was somehow more unsettling than any angry outburst would have been. "Clean it up," Tyler demanded, his voice harder now. The entertainment value was starting to fade, and he needed to escalate to maintain his audience's interest. "Clean up your mess, bookboy." Marcus knelt down again and began picking up the pieces of his lunch. He carefully placed the sandwich, still wrapped in plastic, back on the tray. He picked up the apple, which had rolled several feet away. He gathered up more of the torn pages. Through it all, he remained silent. Tyler watched this display with growing frustration. This wasn't going the way he had planned. Marcus was supposed to fight back, or break down, or at least provide some kind of dramatic reaction that would cement Tyler's reputation as someone not to mess with. Instead, Marcus was just cleaning up quietly, methodically, as if Tyler wasn't even there. "Are you even listening to me?" Tyler demanded, his voice rising. A few students at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the dynamic was changing in ways they didn't quite understand. Marcus stood up again, holding his tray with its salvaged contents. He looked directly at Tyler, and for the second time something passed across his face that Tyler couldn't quite read. "I'm listening," Marcus said simply. Tyler felt a flicker of something that might have been uncertainty, but he pushed it aside. He had gone too far to back down now, and his reputation depended on maintaining the upper hand. He reached out and shoved Marcus in the chest, not hard enough to knock him down, but firmly enough to make him stumble backward. "Then maybe you should start showing some respect," Tyler said. Marcus regained his balance and set his tray down on the table behind him. The movement was careful and controlled, and when he turned back to face Tyler, something had changed. The trembling was gone. The hunched shoulders had straightened. Even his posture seemed different, more centered somehow. "I show respect to people who deserve it," Marcus said, and his voice carried a quiet authority that hadn't been there before. Tyler felt the shift immediately, though he couldn't have put it into words. The entire cafeteria seemed to sense it too. Conversations that had stopped to watch the confrontation remained silent, but now it was a different kind of silence. It was the kind of quiet that comes before something significant happens. "What did you just say to me?" Tyler asked, stepping closer to Marcus. They were now less than 2 feet apart, and Tyler used his height advantage to loom over his target. Marcus didn't step back. He didn't flinch. He looked up at Tyler with calm, steady eyes and repeated himself word for word. "I show respect to people who deserve it." This was not how this was supposed to go. Bookboy was supposed to be scared, apologetic, defeated. Instead, Marcus Thompson was standing there like he had every right to speak to Tyler Rodriguez as an equal, like he didn't understand that he was nobody and Tyler was somebody. You think you're better than me? Tyler demanded.
No.
Marcus said quietly. I think you're better than this. The words hit Tyler like a physical blow. They were said without malice, without sarcasm, with what sounded almost like disappointment. For a moment, Tyler was speechless, caught off guard by the unexpected response. But his friends were watching, and Sarah was recording on her phone, and half the cafeteria was waiting to see what would happen next. Tyler couldn't afford to look weak, couldn't afford to let some nobody bookworm get the better of him in front of everyone. You're about to learn what happens to people who don't know their place, Tyler said, and he drew back his fist. Marcus saw it coming. Everyone in the cafeteria saw it coming. Mrs. Patterson started forward, calling out stop, but what happened next would change everything everyone thought they knew about Marcus Thompson, and it would start with a revelation that no one in that crowded cafeteria could have possibly expected. Tyler's fist never connected with its target. In one fluid motion that seemed to defy everything the cafeteria full of students thought they knew about Marcus Thompson, the quiet boy caught Tyler's incoming punch at the wrist. Not only did he catch it, but he redirected it with such precise control that Tyler found himself stumbling forward, off balance and completely bewildered by what had just happened. The silence in the cafeteria became absolute. Even the kitchen staff had stopped what they were doing, drawn by the sudden change in atmosphere. Students who had been recording on their phones forgot to keep filming, their mouths hanging open as they tried to process what they were seeing. Marcus hadn't moved from his position. He stood exactly where he had been before Tyler threw the punch, but his grip on Tyler's wrist was firm and unmistakably controlled. Tyler tried to pull away, but found that he couldn't. Marcus's fingers, which had looked so thin and weak just moments before, held him in place without any apparent effort. Let go of me, Tyler demanded, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. He pulled harder, putting his full strength into trying to break free, but Marcus's grip didn't budge. I will, Marcus said calmly, when you calm down. Tyler looked around desperately, suddenly aware that the power dynamic had shifted in a way that made no sense to him. His friends Jake and Sarah were staring with the same shocked expressions as everyone else in the cafeteria. Mrs. Patterson had stopped her advance and was watching with the kind of fascination that comes from witnessing something completely unexpected. What are you? Tyler asked, the question coming out before he could stop himself. Marcus released Tyler's wrist so suddenly that Tyler stumbled backward, nearly falling over a chair.
I'm just someone who doesn't like fighting, Marcus said, but his tone suggested there was much more to the story.
Tyler rubbed his wrist, which already showed the clear outline of Marcus's fingers and red marks that would soon become bruises.
He looked at those marks with disbelief, then back up at Marcus's face. The scared, trembling boy from just minutes ago had been replaced by someone who radiated a quiet confidence that was somehow more intimidating than any aggressive posturing could have been. That's impossible, Sarah whispered from behind Tyler, voicing what everyone in the cafeteria was thinking. Marcus Thompson doesn't know how to fight. Mrs. Patterson finally found her voice and began walking toward the confrontation. But Marcus noticed her approach and shook his head slightly. It's okay, Mrs. Patterson, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent cafeteria. Everything's fine here. I don't think everything's fine, she replied, but she stopped walking. Something in Marcus's tone, in the way he carried himself now, made her hesitate to intervene. Tyler was still staring at his wrist, trying to understand how someone he could probably bench press had managed to stop his punch and hold him immobile. He looked back up at Marcus with new eyes, searching for clues he had missed before. That's when Jake, Tyler's best friend, gasped audibly and pointed at Marcus's forearm. When Marcus had caught Tyler's punch, his hoodie sleeve had ridden up slightly, revealing something that made Jake's face go pale. Dude, Jake whispered to Tyler, look at his arm. Tyler followed Jake's gaze and saw what had captured his friend's attention. There, partially visible below the edge of Marcus's sleeve, was what looked like a tattoo. But it wasn't just any tattoo. It was a series of numbers and symbols that Tyler recognized from action movies and military documentaries. Even more shocking was the unmistakable outline of what appeared to be significant muscle definition that Marcus's baggy clothes had been hiding. Show us your arm, Tyler demanded, his voice shaking slightly. Marcus looked down at his sleeve, seemed to consider something for a long moment, then looked back up at Tyler. You really want to know? He asked quietly. Yeah, Tyler said, though he was beginning to suspect that he might not like the answer. Marcus reached up with his left hand and slowly pushed up the sleeve of his right arm. What he revealed sent a collective gasp through the cafeteria that echoed off the walls like a physical thing. Marcus's forearm was covered with tattoos, but these weren't the random designs that some high school students got illegally. These were military tattoos, professional,
precise, and telling a story that no 17-year-old should have had to live. There were numbers that represented deployments, symbols that indicated specialized training, and at the top, partially visible below his rolled-up sleeve, was the unmistakable outline of a military unit insignia.
But the tattoos weren't what made the cafeteria erupt in whispers and shocked exclamations. It was the scars.
Marcus's arm was crisscrossed with scars, some clearly from cuts, others that looked like they might have come from burns or explosions. These weren't the kinds of scars that came from normal teenage accidents. These were war wounds. What the hell? Tyler breathed, taking an involuntary step backward. Marcus rolled his sleeve back down, covering the evidence of whatever life he had lived before Jefferson High School. Like I said, he replied calmly, I don't like fighting. The implications of what they had just seen began to sink in around the cafeteria. Students were pulling out their phones again, not to record a typical high school confrontation, but to try to capture evidence of something that seemed impossible. Marcus Thompson, the quiet kid who got picked on and never fought back, had military tattoos and battle scars. Sarah found her voice first. You're not 17, she said, and it came out as an accusation. Marcus looked at her with something that might have been sadness. I am 17, he said.
I'm just 17 with some unusual experiences. What kind of experiences? Mrs. Patterson asked, having moved close enough to join the conversation.
Her voice was gentle but insistent, carrying the tone of an adult who was beginning to understand that she was dealing with something far outside her normal expertise. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking around the cafeteria at all the faces staring at him. Every student in the room was hanging on his next words, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of what they had just witnessed. The kind that teach you that fighting should always be the last option, Marcus finally said.
But Tyler wasn't ready to let it go.
His humiliation in front of the entire cafeteria, the way Marcus had effortlessly stopped his punch and held him immobile, the shocking revelation of the tattoos and scars, it all combined to push him past rational thought. I don't care what kind of fake tough guy act you're putting on, Tyler said, his voice rising. You're still just book boy to me. He reached forward and shoved Marcus again, harder this time, putting all his weight behind it. It was a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his high school career.
Marcus didn't stumble this time. He absorbed the shove like it was nothing more than a gentle push. His feet planted solidly on the cafeteria floor.
But more than that, the shove seemed to trigger something in him. Not anger, but a kind of alert stillness that made every person in the cafeteria suddenly aware that they were in the presence of someone dangerous. Tyler, Marcus said, and his voice had changed. It was still quiet, but it now carried an unmistakable authority that cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade. You need to stop. Or what? Tyler challenged. But even as he said it, he was beginning to understand that he had made a serious miscalculation. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made Mrs. Patterson gasp and several students back away from their table. It was a military ID card, worn and creased from use, but unmistakably official. He held it up so Tyler and the nearest students could see it clearly. The photo was definitely Marcus, though. He looked somehow older and more serious in the military portrait. The name on the card read SGT Marcus A. Thompson, and below that were a series of numbers and codes that meant nothing to the high school students, but everything to anyone familiar with military documentation. My name is Sergeant Marcus Thompson, he said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent cafeteria. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment. I've been awarded the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, and the Combat Infantry Badge. I'm 17 years old because I enlisted at 15 with my parents' permission after my older brother was killed in action. The cafeteria had become so quiet that the sound of someone dropping a fork in the kitchen seemed to echo like a gunshot. Students were staring at Marcus with expressions that ranged from disbelief to awe to something approaching fear.
I don't tell people about my service record because I came to Jefferson High to have a normal teenage experience, Marcus continued. I wanted to read books and worry about homework, and maybe make some friends. I wanted to forget about IEDs and firefights and watching good people die for causes they believed in. Tyler's face had gone completely white. All the bluster and aggression had drained out of him as the reality of what Marcus was telling them sank in. He was looking at the military ID with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that he had been bullying an actual war hero. You're making this up, Tyler said weakly. But even he didn't sound convinced. Marcus reached into his other pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He scrolled through it for a moment, then turned the screen toward Tyler and the gathered crowd.
The photo he showed them was of Marcus in full military gear, standing with a group of soldiers in what was clearly a combat zone.
He looked older in the photo despite being younger, his face serious and his eyes holding a weight that no teenager should carry. "This was taken outside Kandahar 3 months before my 18th birthday," Marcus said. "2 days after this photo was taken, our convoy hit an IED. 3 of the guys in this picture didn't make it home."
Sarah started crying, not the dramatic tears of a teenager seeking attention, but the quiet, shocked crying of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had been witnessing.
Several other students were wiping their eyes, and even some of the tougher kids were looking uncomfortable. Tyler stared at the photo, then back at Marcus's face, then down at his own hands, as if he couldn't believe what they had been doing just minutes before. "I'm sorry," Tyler whispered, and his voice cracked on the words. "I didn't know. I'm so sorry."
Marcus put his phone away and looked around the cafeteria at all the students who had been watching the confrontation.
"None of you knew," he said, and his voice was gentle again. "I never told anyone because I didn't want to be treated differently.
I just wanted to be a regular student." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her face a mix of amazement and concern.
"Marcus," she said softly, "why didn't you ever say anything when students were picking on you, when you were being bullied? Why didn't you defend yourself?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking down at the torn pages of his book that were still scattered on the floor around his feet.
When he looked back up, his expression was sadder than anyone in the cafeteria had ever seen. "Because I've done enough fighting for one lifetime," he said simply, "and because I know what I'm capable of when I stop holding back." The implications of that statement hit the cafeteria like a physical wave. This quiet, unassuming boy who had absorbed months of bullying and harassment without fighting back wasn't weak or scared. He was a trained soldier showing incredible restraint. He had been protecting his tormentors from himself, not the other way around. But even as the truth about Marcus Thompson was sinking in around the cafeteria, there was one more shock coming that would change everything everyone thought they understood about heroism, sacrifice, and what it really means to serve others. The revelation about Marcus's military service had left the entire cafeteria in stunned silence, but what happened next would prove that they had only scratched the surface of who Marcus Thompson really was.
Principal Williams burst through the cafeteria doors with the kind of urgency that suggested he had heard about the confrontation from other staff members. He took in the scene quickly, the scattered book pages on the floor, the crowd of students standing in unusual silence, Tyler looking pale and shaken, and Marcus at the center of it all with his military ID still visible in his hand.
"What's going on here?" Principal Williams demanded, but his tone changed when he saw the ID. He moved closer, squinting at it, then looked up at Marcus with surprise.
"Is that real?"
"Yes, sir," Marcus replied, automatically falling into the respectful tone he used with superior officers. Principal Williams examined the ID more carefully, then looked back at Marcus, with an expression that combined amazement with something that might have been recognition.
"Sergeant Thompson," he said formally, and several students gasped at hearing their quiet classmate addressed with a military title by the principal. "You know about his service?" Mrs.
Patterson asked, clearly surprised. Principal Williams nodded slowly. "I had to verify his enrollment documents when he transferred here at the beginning of the school year. His records were unusual."
He looked around at the gathered students, then back at Marcus.
"But I don't think even his official records tell the whole story, do they, Sergeant?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and those who were watching closely could see him weighing his options. He looked around the cafeteria at all the faces staring at him, some filled with newfound respect, others with curiosity, and a few with something approaching awe.
"No, sir," Marcus finally said. "They don't tell the whole story." Tyler, who had been standing silently since learning about Marcus's military service, found his voice. "What else is there?" he asked, though his tone had completely changed. The arrogance and aggression were gone, replaced by genuine curiosity and what sounded like regret.
Marcus looked directly at Tyler for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. "The reason I don't like fighting," he said, "isn't just because I've seen too much of it.
It's because of what happened during my second deployment." He paused, looking around the cafeteria again, and students who had been standing began to sit down, sensing that whatever Marcus was about to tell them required their full attention.
"We were conducting a humanitarian mission in a small village outside Kabul," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone recounting events that were painful but important. "Intel had reported that the village was being used as a supply route by insurgents, but when we got there we found mostly families, women, children, elderly people who just wanted to live their lives in peace.
Mrs. Patterson pulled up a chair, and Principal Williams did the same. Even some of the kitchen staff had moved closer to listen, drawn by the gravity in Marcus's voice. Our orders were to search for weapons and supply caches. But what we found instead was a school. Marcus continued. A makeshift school where a young woman named Amara was teaching about 30 children to read and write in a storage room behind her family's home. Sarah, who had stopped crying but was still wiping her eyes, asked quietly, "What happened to the school?" Marcus was silent for almost a minute, staring down at his hands. When he looked back up, his eyes held a pain that was almost physical to witness. The insurgents had been using the school as cover, he said. They had been storing weapons in the same building where those children were learning to read. When we discovered this, we had to make a choice. Either evacuate the building and let the insurgents escape with their weapons, or risk the safety of 30 innocent children. The cafeteria was so quiet now that the sound of breathing seemed loud. Tyler had sat down at the nearest table, his earlier confrontation with Marcus seemingly forgotten in the face of this larger story. "What did you do?" Principal Williams asked gently. "I volunteered to go in alone," Marcus said. "My commanding officer told me it was too dangerous, that we should call for backup and wait for a full tactical team. But I knew that by the time backup arrived, either the insurgents would be gone with their weapons, or they might decide to use the children as human shields." Marcus stood up and walked over to where his torn book pages were scattered on the floor.
He knelt down and began collecting them again, but this time his movements were different, more deliberate, as if the simple act of gathering the pages was helping him find the words to continue his story. "I went into the building through a back entrance," he continued as he worked.
The plan was to locate the weapons cache, secure it, and evacuate the children without alerting the insurgents to our presence. Simple and clean.
But it wasn't simple, Jake said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation had begun. Marcus looked up at him from where he knelt on the floor. "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't simple at all." He stood up with the collected pages in his hands and walked back to his table, but instead of sitting down, he remained standing, facing his audience of classmates, teachers, and staff. "I found the weapons cache exactly where Intel said it would be," Marcus continued. "But I also found something else. 3 insurgents were in the building, and they had discovered the school. They were planning to use the children as hostages to negotiate safe passage out of the village." The implications of what he was describing began to sink in around the cafeteria. These weren't abstract military operations or distant news stories. Marcus was describing a situation where he had been personally responsible for the lives of 30 children. "I had 2 choices," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of emotion that made it clear this memory still haunted him. "I could retreat, call for backup, and hope that negotiations would save the children, or I could act immediately to neutralize the threat myself."
Tyler leaned forward in his chair.
"What did you do?" Marcus was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the pause of someone gathering their thoughts, but the silence of someone about to reveal something that had changed them fundamentally.
"I did what I was trained to do," Marcus said finally. "I neutralized the threat." The simple words carried a weight that everyone in the cafeteria understood, even if they didn't want to acknowledge it directly.
Marcus Thompson, their quiet classmate who read books alone and never fought back when he was bullied, had killed 3 people to save 30 children. Mrs. Patterson covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been admiration. Principal Williams nodded slowly, his expression grave but understanding. "All 30 children made it out safely," Marcus continued. "Amara, their teacher, was able to continue running her school in a new location that we helped secure. The weapons cache was destroyed, and the insurgent supply route through the village was shut down permanently." "You saved them," Sarah whispered. "I did my job," Marcus corrected, but not harshly. "And it was the right thing to do. But killing people, even people who are threatening innocent lives, changes you. It has to change you or you're not human." He looked around the cafeteria again, his gaze stopping on each face that was staring back at him. "That's why I came to Jefferson High," he said. "That's why I wanted to just read books and do homework and be treated like a normal teenager. Because after making life and death decisions at 16 years old, after carrying responsibility for other people's lives, I wanted to remember what it felt like to worry about normal things." Tyler stood up slowly, his face a mixture of shame and amazement. "And instead of getting to be normal," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we made you a target. We bullied a war hero." "You bullied a classmate," Marcus corrected gently. My service record doesn't make me more or less worthy of respect than anyone else in this cafeteria.
The irony of his words hit Tyler like a physical blow. Here was someone who could have defended himself easily, who had been showing incredible restraint by allowing the bullying to continue, telling them that respect came from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves.
But you could have defended yourself, Jake said, voicing what everyone was thinking. You could have stopped us anytime you wanted to. Marcus nodded.
Yes, I could have. But then what would I have learned about you?
About myself? About what kind of person I wanted to be when I wasn't carrying a rifle and following orders. He walked over to Tyler, who was still standing beside his table, looking like his entire worldview had been shattered and rebuilt in the space of 30 minutes.
I learned that you're not a bad person, Tyler, Marcus said, extending his hand. You're just someone who is trying to figure out his place in the world by pushing other people around. That's actually pretty normal for teenagers. The difference is that now you know better, and you get to decide who you want to be going forward.
Tyler stared at the offered hand, then looked up into Marcus's eyes. What he saw there wasn't anger or resentment, but something that looked almost like forgiveness.
I don't deserve this, Tyler said, his voice cracking. Deserving doesn't have anything to do with it, Marcus replied. This is just me choosing to treat you the way I wish everyone would treat each other. Tyler took Marcus's hand, and as they shook, something passed between them that everyone in the cafeteria could see. It wasn't just forgiveness or reconciliation. It was the moment when a bully realized he could choose to become someone better, and a hero showed him that redemption was always possible. The cafeteria erupted in applause, but it wasn't the kind of excited clapping that usually followed high school drama. It was the respectful applause of people who had witnessed something profound and life-changing. Principal Williams stood up and addressed the gathered students. I think we've all learned something important today, he said, about assumptions, about heroism, about the kind of people we choose to be when we think no one is watching. As students began to disperse, returning to their lunches and their conversations with a new understanding of their quiet classmate, Marcus knelt down one more time to collect the remaining pages of his book. But this time, he wasn't alone. Tyler knelt beside him, carefully gathering the torn pieces, and soon Sarah and Jake had joined them. We'll help you get a new copy, Sarah said as they worked together to collect every scrap of paper. Marcus looked at her with genuine gratitude. Thank you, he said, but I think I can fix this one. I've learned that sometimes the things that get torn apart can be put back together again, and they end up stronger than they were before. As they worked together to clean up the mess that Tyler's bullying had made, it became clear that Marcus wasn't just talking about his book. He was talking about second chances, about redemption, about the possibility that even the worst situations could be transformed into opportunities for growth and connection.
The quiet kid who had wanted nothing more than to read his book in peace had ended up teaching an entire cafeteria full of teenagers about courage, forgiveness, and what it really means to be a hero. And in doing so, he had finally gotten what he had been looking for all along. Not just respect, but genuine friendship, and the chance to be seen as the person he truly was.
Marcus Thompson had served his country with honor, saved innocent lives, and earned medals for his courage under fire. But his greatest victory would always be the day he chose compassion over retaliation, and showed a cafeteria full of teenagers that true strength comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when not to use that ability. In the months that followed, Jefferson High would become known not for its sports teams or academic achievements, but for producing students who understood that heroes come in all forms and that sometimes the quietest person in the room has the most important story to tell.